In a small, fog-drenched town, a mysterious figure began appearing every night at the edge of the forest. Cloaked in tattered rags, the stranger would stand motionless, staring at the townsfolk with hollow, unblinking eyes. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some claimed he was a lost soul, others a vengeful spirit. Children dared each other to approach him, but no one ever did. One evening, a group of drunk men decided to confront him, hurling insults and stones. The stranger didn't flinch, didn't speak. Frustrated, they lunged at him, only to freeze mid-step as the figure's form began to shift. His tattered cloak fell away, revealing a figure of pure shadow, with eyes that burned like embers. The men stumbled back, but it was too late. The shadow stretched toward them, swallowing their screams. The next morning, the town awoke to silence. The stranger was gone, but the men were never seen again. And though no one dared speak of it, the townsfolk knew the forest had claimed its due. To this day, when the fog rolls in, the townsfolk lock their doors and whisper a warning. Beware the stranger in the shadows, for he is not what he seems. The townsfolk lived in uneasy silence, their fear of the forest growing with each passing day. The children no longer played near the edge of the woods, and the adults avoided even glancing in its direction. But the shadowy figure's absence was only temporary. One stormy night, the wind howled through the streets, rattling windows and extinguishing lanterns. A single knock echoed through the town, loud enough to be heard in every home. Those brave enough to peek through their curtains saw him, the stranger standing in the center of the square, his tattered cloak billowing in the storm. This time he wasn't alone. Behind him, faint silhouettes of the missing men flickered in and out of existence, their faces twisted in silent agony. The stranger raised a hand, pointing toward the town's oldest building, the church. The doors creaked open on their own, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the light. The townsfolk watched in horror as the shadowy figure began to move toward the church, the spectral figures trailing behind him. No one dared to follow. No one dared to speak. But as the church doors slammed shut, a single word echoed through the night, carried on the wind. Soon, the town held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The stranger's warning hung heavy in the air, and the forest seemed to grow darker, closer, as if it were watching, waiting. Days turned into weeks, and the town remained on edge. The church stood untouched, its doors sealed as if fused by an unseen force. No one dared approach it, not even the town's bravest souls. But as the tension grew, new faces began to emerge. Strangers drawn to the town by rumors of the shadowy figure and the cursed forest. First came Eliza, a young woman with piercing green eyes and a satchel filled with strange trinkets. She claimed to be a folklorist, studying tales of the supernatural. The townsfolk eyed her warily, but she was undeterred. "Every legend has a kernel of truth," she said, her voice steady, "and I intend to find it." Next arrived Father Marcus, a priest with a haunted past. His arrival was unexpected, and he carried an air of quiet authority. He spoke of redemption and confronting evil, but his hands trembled slightly when he mentioned the church. "Some sins," he murmured, "refuse to stay buried." Lastly, there was Jonah, a grizzled hunter with a scar running down his cheek. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder and a necklace of strange charms. "I've dealt with things like this before," he said, his voice gruff. "But this feels different." The three newcomers formed an uneasy alliance, each driven by their own reasons to uncover the truth. Eliza spent her days poring over old town records, Father Marcus prayed fervently, and Jonah patrolled the forest's edge, his rifle always at the ready. One night, as the moon hung low and full, the church doors creaked open once more. A faint, mournful wail drifted through the town, chilling the bones of all who heard it. Eliza, Father Marcus, and Jonah stood together in the square, their eyes fixed on the church. "This is it," Jonah said, tightening his grip on his rifle. "We must proceed with caution," Father Marcus warned, clutching a worn Bible. Eliza adjusted her satchel, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Whatever's in there, it's been waiting for us." As they stepped toward the church, the shadowy figure materialized in the doorway, his burning eyes locking onto theirs. Behind him, the spectral figures of the missing men writhed and twisted, their mouths open in silent screams. The stranger raised a hand, and the ground beneath the trio began to tremble. The forest seemed to come alive, its trees groaning as if in pain. "You seek answers," the stranger's voice echoed, deep and resonant. "But are you prepared for the cost?" The trio exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could respond, the church doors slammed shut behind the stranger, plunging the square into darkness. The wind howled, carrying with it a single, chilling word, "Enter." And so, they stepped forward, the weight of the town's fate resting on their shoulders. The forest loomed closer, its shadows stretching toward them like grasping hands. The stranger's warning lingered in the air, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The trio hesitated at the threshold of the church, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The stranger's voice still echoed in their minds, a haunting reminder of the danger they were stepping into. Eliza tightened her grip on her satchel. Father Marcus clutched his Bible tighter, and Jonah adjusted his rifle, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. As they crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind them, plunging them into complete darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing. Then, faintly, the flicker of candlelight appeared, illuminating the church's interior. The pews were empty, but the air felt heavy, as if filled with unseen presences. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, symbols Eliza recognized from her research. "These are ancient," she whispered, running her fingers over the markings. "Protection spells or warnings." Father Marcus stepped forward, his voice trembling as he recited a prayer. But the words seemed to dissipate into the air, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Jonah's sharp eyes caught movement in the shadows. "We're not alone," he muttered, raising his rifle. From the darkness, the spectral figures of the missing men emerged, their forms flickering like dying flames. Their faces were twisted in agony, their mouths moving as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. The stranger appeared again, his shadowy form towering over them. "You seek the truth," he said, his voice echoing like thunder. "But the truth is a burden few can bear." Eliza stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're not afraid. Tell us what happened here." The stranger's burning gaze fixed on her. "This town was built on blood and betrayal. The forest remembers. It demands justice." Father Marcus interrupted, his voice shaking. "What do you want from us? From them?" He gestured to the spectral figures. The stranger's form shifted, the shadows around him swirling like a storm. "They are bound by their sins, and you carry the weight of your own." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them began to crack, and the walls of the church seemed to close in. The spectral figures lunged forward, their silent screams filling the air. Jonah fired his rifle, but the bullets passed through the figures harmlessly. "We can't fight them," he shouted. Eliza reached into her satchel, pulling out a small, intricately carved box. "I have something that might help," she said, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a strange, glowing artifact, a relic she had found in her travels. The stranger's eyes narrowed. "You dare bring that here?" Before Eliza could respond, the artifact began to glow brighter, and the spectral figures recoiled, their forms flickering violently. The stranger let out a roar, his shadowy form expanding, filling the church with darkness. "Run!" Eliza shouted, clutching the artifact. The trio turned and bolted for the doors, which creaked open just enough for them to slip through. As they stumbled into the square, the church doors slammed shut behind them, and the town fell eerily silent once more. But the stranger's voice followed them, echoing in their minds. "You cannot escape what is to come." The trio stood in the square, breathless and shaken, knowing their actions had only delayed the inevitable. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows deeper than ever, and the town's fate hung in the balance. Somewhere in the darkness, the stranger waited, his presence a constant reminder that the truth was far more terrifying than they could have imagined. And the forest was still watching. The trio stood in the square, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The artifact in Eliza's hands dimmed, its glow fading as if drained by the encounter. The church loomed behind them, silent and foreboding, while the forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its shadows shifting like restless spirits. "We need to regroup," Jonah said, his voice low but firm. "That thing in there, it's not just a ghost, it's something older, something worse." Father Marcus nodded, his face pale. The symbols in the church, they weren't just warnings. They were a seal, and we may have just broken it. Eliza clutched the artifact tightly, her mind racing. This relic, it reacted to him, to the stranger. There's a connection. If we can figure out what it is, maybe we can stop him. As they spoke, a faint sound reached their ears, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the direction of the forest. The townsfolk, who had been hiding in their homes, began to emerge, their faces blank, their eyes glazed over. They moved in unison, drawn toward the forest as if in a trance. "What's happening to them?" Eliza whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "The forest is calling them," Father Marcus said, his voice grim. "It's been waiting for this moment." Jonah raised his rifle, but Eliza stopped him. "We can't fight them. They're not in control of themselves." The trio watched in horror as the townsfolk disappeared into the trees, their chanting growing louder, more urgent. The forest seemed to welcome them, its shadows parting like a curtain. "We have to follow them," Eliza said, her determination returning. "Whatever's happening, it's connected to the stranger, and if we don't stop it, the entire town will be lost." Father Marcus hesitated. "If we go in there, we may not come back out." Jonah adjusted his rifle, his jaw set. "We don't have a choice." With a shared nod, the trio moved toward the forest, the artifact's faint glow their only source of light. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and the chanting grew louder, echoing in their minds. Deep within the forest, they found a clearing. The townsfolk stood in a circle, their heads bowed, their voices rising in unison. At the center of the clearing stood the stranger, his shadowy form towering over them. His burning eyes locked onto the trio as they approached. "You should not have come," he said, his voice a low growl. "But now that you are here, you will witness the reckoning." The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching toward the trio. The artifact in Eliza's hands flared to life, its light pushing back the encroaching darkness. "We're not afraid of you," Eliza said, though her voice wavered. "We'll find a way to stop this." The stranger's laughter echoed through the clearing, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The forest remembers, and it will have its due." As the chanting reached a fever pitch, the ground split open, revealing a deep, yawning chasm. From within, a faint, otherworldly light began to rise, and the air filled with the scent of decay and ancient earth. The trio stood their ground, their resolve hardening. They knew the stakes, they knew the cost, but they also knew they were the only ones who could stand against the darkness. And as the light from the chasm grew brighter, the stranger's form began to shift, his shadowy figure merging with the forest itself. The final act was about to begin, and the trio would have to face the truth of what lay beneath the town and within themselves. The forest watched, waiting, as the battle for the town's soul began. The chasm's light grew blinding, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters on the trees. The stranger's form dissolved into the forest, his voice echoing from every direction, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. "The forest remembers," the voices hissed. "It always remembers." Eliza tightened her grip on the artifact, its glow pulsating in rhythm with her heartbeat. "We need to close the chasm," she said, her voice urgent. "If we don't, whatever's down there will consume everything." Father Marcus stepped forward, his Bible clutched tightly. "I'll try to hold it back with prayer, but I don't know how long it will last." Jonah nodded, his rifle at the ready. "I'll cover you, but we need to move fast." The trio advanced toward the chasm, the townsfolk's chanting growing louder, more frenzied. The ground trembled violently, and the air grew thick with the scent of sulfur and rot. From the depths of the chasm, tendrils of shadow began to rise, writhing like serpents. Father Marcus began to recite a prayer, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. The tendrils recoiled slightly, but they didn't retreat. "It's not enough," he said, his voice strained. "We need more." Eliza knelt at the edge of the chasm, the artifact in her hands. She studied the symbols carved into its surface, her mind racing. "These symbols, they're a key, but I don't know how to use it." The stranger's laughter echoed again, louder this time. "You cannot undo what has been done. The forest's hunger cannot be sated." Jonah fired a shot into the darkness, but the bullet vanished into the void. "We need a plan, and we need it now." Eliza's eyes widened as she noticed something. A pattern in the artifact's glow. It matched the symbols on the church walls. "The church, it's the anchor. If we can reactivate the seal, we might be able to close the chasm." Father Marcus nodded. "Then we need to get back there. But how?" Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them shifted, and the chasm began to widen. The tendrils of shadow lashed out, wrapping around the townsfolk and dragging them toward the abyss. Their chanting turned to screams, but they made no effort to resist. "We can't leave them," Eliza shouted. "We don't have a choice," Jonah replied, grabbing her arm. "If we don't stop this now, there won't be anyone left to save." The trio turned and ran, the forest seeming to close in around them. The trees twisted and groaned, their branches reaching out like claws. The artifact's light pushed back the darkness, but it was growing dimmer with every step. As they neared the edge of the forest, the church came into view. Its doors were open, and a faint light spilled from within. But standing in the doorway was the stranger, his form solid once more, his burning eyes fixed on them. "You cannot escape," he said, his voice a low growl. "The forest will have its due." Eliza held up the artifact, its glow flickering weakly. "We're not trying to escape. We're going to stop you." The stranger's form shifted, his shadowy figure expanding to block their path. "You are brave," he said, his voice almost mocking. "But bravery will not save you." Father Marcus stepped forward, his Bible raised. "In the name of the divine, I command you to step aside." The stranger hesitated, his form flickering. For a moment, it seemed as though the prayer had an effect. But then he laughed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Your faith is strong, priest, but it is not enough." Jonah raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Then we'll do this the hard way." The stranger's eyes burned brighter, and the ground beneath them began to crack. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final confrontation. The trio stood together, their resolve unshaken. They knew the odds were against them. They knew the cost could be their lives. But they also knew they were the only ones who could stand against the darkness. And as the stranger advanced, the artifact's light flickered one last time, a faint spark of hope in the encroaching shadows. The battle for the town's soul was far from over, and the forest watched, waiting to see who would emerge victorious. The stranger lunged forward, his shadowy form stretching toward the trio like a tidal wave of darkness. Jonah fired his rifle, the shot piercing through the stranger's form, but it did little to slow him. Father Marcus continued his prayer, his voice rising above the chaos, while Eliza focused on the artifact, her fingers tracing the symbols frantically. "It's not working," she shouted, her voice desperate. "I can't figure out how to activate it." The stranger's laughter echoed through the air, his form looming over them. "Your efforts are futile. The forest's hunger is eternal." But as the darkness closed in, Eliza's eyes widened with realization. The artifact, it's not just a key, it's a mirror. It reflects what's inside us. She turned to Father Marcus and Jonah, her voice urgent. We have to face our own sins. That's how we activate it. Father Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Then we do it together. The trio closed their eyes, each confronting the darkness within themselves. Eliza thought of the lives she'd failed to save in her travels, Father Marcus of the doubts that had plagued his faith, and Jonah of the violence he'd committed in the name of survival. As they faced their inner demons, the artifact began to glow brighter, its light pushing back the stranger's shadowy form. The symbols on its surface lit up one by one, and a powerful energy surged through the air. The stranger recoiled, his form flickering. No, this cannot be. Eliza stepped forward, holding the artifact high. The forest may remember, but so do we, and we choose to fight. With a final, blinding burst of light, the artifact activated. The ground shook violently, and the chasm in the forest began to close. The stranger let out a roar of fury as his form disintegrated. His shadowy essence pulled back into the abyss. The townsfolk, freed from their trance, collapsed to the ground, their chanting replaced by cries of confusion and relief. The forest fell silent, its shadows retreating as if chastised. As the light from the artifact faded, the trio stood together, exhausted but victorious. The church doors creaked shut, and the town was bathed in an eerie but peaceful silence. Eliza looked down at the artifact, now dull and lifeless. "It's over," she said softly. Father Marcus nodded, his face weary but resolute. "The forest's hunger has been sated, for now." Jonah slung his rifle over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But we'll be ready if it ever returns." The townsfolk began to stir, their faces filled with gratitude and fear. The trio knew their work wasn't done. There were wounds to heal, stories to tell, and a town to rebuild. But for now, they had won. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the forest stood still, its secrets buried once more. But somewhere, deep within its shadows, the stranger's voice whispered one final warning. The forest remembers, and it waits. And so, the town lived on, forever changed by the darkness they had faced. But the trio knew they had done what was necessary. They had stared into the abyss and emerged victorious.